The mystery of the man in room 1046 has baffled people for almost 100 years. And yet, has the solution been staring us in the face the whole time? Well, I believe there's a couple of clues that unravels this intriguing case. So, let's put it to the pub test. G'day, I'm Owen, you've joined the pub test, and this is an intriguing case. And as I stated in the intro, I do believe that there are a couple of clues that point to the actual solution for this enduring mystery. So let's go through the story, look at some theories, and then I will give what I believe is the solution to the man known initially as Roland T Owen in room 1046. And this begins back in Kansas City, Missouri in 1935, early January. A bloke who, people from the motel, it's confusing to me because a hotel in Australia is basically a pub. But this is a fancy place, so it's the President Hotel. They look at this bloke and think he's in his early 20s, perhaps even into his 30s. Very well presented bloke. And he has a request that he has a secluded room. Now, the President Hotel had an intriguing design. So it was basically a rectangle or a square, but in the middle. So if an interior room, not facing the streets, would look down into an open courtyard. Well, he wanted one of the rooms on a higher level and an interior one, so he could look into the courtyard. Now, one of the, is it bellhops or concierges or whatever they're called in these places, go up with him. But there was absolutely no reason for this staff member to go up with him. And I believe this particular bloke's last name was Probst. But he goes up with him, maybe just to get the tip, because that happens in the United States too. You got to tip the people. That's how they really get paid. Because Roland T Owen didn't have any luggage. He only had his jacket on. And so the staff member helps him and shows him to where the room is, room 1046. So he's on level 10, room number 46. And the staff member sees him unpack all of his belongings, which consisted of a comb, a hairbrush, and some toothpaste. Intriguingly, absolutely no toothbrush to be seen, and also no change of clothing. Now, he did only check in for one night, so therefore, it would make sense that he wasn't carrying much luggage, perhaps just a quick business trip. But Owen leaves with the staff member, and he gets his key, and the door is locked behind them. Now, this is an important detail that we have to cover, the locking system of the President Hotel. So as a guest, they would give you a key. Now, if you were leaving your room, you would just lock your door, not a problem. But then a staff member, say a part of the cleaning staff, could come up with a little pass key they had. It was like an analog punch card with little holes and dots and so forth, and they could insert that, and it would unlock if the guest had locked the door from the outside, because then the door would open and they would know nobody was in the room. And I think that is quite a great system, because if you've ever been in a service industry and you're trying to get access to a place, you're banging on the door, like cleaning or trade service, whatever you're trying to do to let people know you're coming in, and people could still be in the room. But with this system, with the door locked from the outside, you could access with your little key. But if you tried your little pass key and the door was still locked, it meant that the guest had turned the key on the inside and a deadlock would have gone across. Therefore, you would need to have a master key then to access the room, but you would also know that someone was still in the room. Now, that's important because of what happens next. So Roland T Owen has checked into this President Hotel. He's gone out with the staff member, but then another staff member comes up to make up the room. Now, today you would expect the room already to be made up and there would be no need for them to come in, but in this case, a staff member by Mary Soptic. Anyway, Mary, she goes in to tidy up the room, get it ready. She inserts the pass key, the door opens, she walks in, and then in this dimly lit room, so the curtains are drawn, or down, I should say, there's just a little lamp, and sitting on the chair in the room is Roland T Owen, and scares the life out of Mary. She's like, sorry, I didn't know you were in here. And I'll leave, I'll give you your privacy. And she's about to bail. And Owen says, no, that's all right. You come in and make up the room. But that shows that the door had to have been locked from the outside. Someone else now had the key. No one had seen Roland T Owen return to room 1046. The fact that Owen had been locked in the room may not have alarmed Mary in itself, though it said she was surprised that he was in there because she was expecting a woman to have been in the room, because when, like last shift, a woman had been in the room, and it didn't seem that booking arrangements were like rock solid. You had to check out at a certain time. It looks like if you got the room, you'd pay for a night, and then you could stay as many nights as you like and then just finish up on your way out, like pay your bill. So she may have thought that this woman was still staying, and so seeing this bloke just gave her a bit of a start. Yet it was possible that Owen wasn't the only person staying in that room, so it didn't sort of raise alarms like, hang on, why is this bloke locked in here? He's not a prisoner or anything. It wasn't a concern to her. But she did say that Owen seemed to have a bit of a startled or frightened expression on his face. Of course, that could be, considering hindsight, of what happens over the course of the coming days. But Roland T Owen doesn't engage in much conversation with Mary, but then says, look, I'm stepping out. Can you not lock the door on your way out, because I have a friend coming to visit and I don't know, like he might come while I'm gone. And so Owen leaves and Mary doesn't lock the door when she's finished and she's gone. But their cleaning system at the President Hotel meant that you would take the dirty towels out of the room and then return later with the fresh linen. They didn't drop them off at the same time when they're making up the room. So she comes back later that afternoon, again unlocks the door with her key card. This time, Owen is back in the room, fully dressed, looking like he's passed out on the bed. Now, Mary says he may have been drunk. It's still afternoon, but it's a possibility. She drops the towels, but then notices a note on the side of the little bedstand saying, Don, I'll be back in 15 minutes. Wait. Doesn't think anything more of it and disappears. In her mind, it's probably the bloke that was coming up to visit him earlier, and that may have been a note that he decided to leave for him. So the following morning, Mary returns to make up the room. Now, remembering Owen had only booked in for the one night, but for whatever reason, and I find this detail just a little bit odd, but she used the master key to open the door. So Roland T Owen had locked the door from the inside, but maybe she felt comfortable, don't know, but she unlocks the door and goes on in, and there is Owen sitting in exactly the same spot as was the day before, in the chair in the dimly lit room. But this time, he begins engaging in some conversation with Mary, asking about the arrangements in the hotel. Do they have permanent residences? And does she just look after certain floors? Or how many rooms does she have to clean? And so forth. And they're having a nice little chat. And then a phone call comes in. And obviously Mary can only hear one side of it. But he's saying, no, Don, I'm not hungry. I've already had breakfast. No, I'm not hungry. And then Owen hangs up the phone. So again, Mary is returning later that afternoon to bring fresh towels. And she hears inside room 1046 a different voice this time. Not the voice of Roland T Owen. She knocks on the door. And it's like, who is it? Totally different voice, remember. She says, it's cleaning. I just got some fresh towels. And the voice says, we don't need towels. We've got plenty. Now, Mary knows that that is not the case because she removed the towels. They couldn't have got towels anywhere else. But, who cares? You don't want towels? Don't have towels. Not really my problem. And she moves on. But that night, which I believe was January the 4th in 1935, a couple of other odd events happened around this hotel president. Firstly, a lady by the name of Jean Owen got a room and they put her in room 1048. Now, it's said that her boyfriend, Joe Reinhardt, came to visit her in that room. So he lived in the area and she'd come over to visit and then wasn't feeling well, couldn't make the trip all the way home, so decided to check into a motel room. So the boyfriend says, well, I might take a game of chess around to that room, or maybe perhaps a game of Monopoly. Probably wasn't Monopoly because he only stayed for 2 hours, so it must have been a game of chess. Because that's obviously what he was doing in that room with her. And then he left at around about 11 o'clock at night. But it said that Jean Owen didn't get much sleep after he left because she could hear an argument, or rather a bit of a party happening next door in room 1046. It was an absolute wild shindig happening down in room 1055. And these were small rooms. Like they were like 12 meter square, apparently, not huge at all. And so I don't know how you would have a big party in a room, but regardless, she said she could hear 4 people in the room 1046, 2 blokes, 2 women. And then she said later in the night she believed in room 1046 an argument was taking place, a big brouhaha. People were using language and yelling. She was just about to jump on the phone and ring down to reception saying, look, can you come and sort this out? But she didn't bother. By around 4 a.m., it said everything had settled down in the place. Also, there was another bit of an odd event. A commercial woman, it said, who was known to the hotel staff to go visit certain blokes in their rooms, was on the room, level 10, I should say, and was going to room 1024. Now, a lot of people state that she was going to visit room 1046, but that's actually not the case. She was apparently meant to visit a bloke in room 1024 because that was a regular arrangement she had, but that bloke wasn't there. And so it's possible one of the staff said, well, have you tried room 1046? But oddly, she couldn't find the person she was looking for, but she went down a level to level 9, stayed there for half an hour, and then went back to level 10 and then left. And that's all sort of verified by the person manning the elevator. Just odd, but it's not to say that it wasn't, like that was an uncommon practice. But it does add a little bit of intrigue into this story, because did she knock on the door there at room 1046? Remembering Jean Owen had heard more than one person in that room. Now, you would think that a primary establishment like the Hotel President's got quite the grand name, that you wouldn't have these wild parties allowing people to argue and having a door-to-door saleswoman going around to the rooms at night time. But it's funny that Roland T Owen said to a couple of staff members on numerous occasions that he had stayed at the Muleback, I think that's how you say it, hotel, which was nearby. But they were charging $5 a night. And he said, that's just exorbitant. So he said, oh, this one is much more reasonable. So I guess you get what you pay for. However, it's not to say that the Hotel President was a dump, because it wasn't. It was quite the classy place. And like lots of people of high standing were traveling through. But maybe level 10 had slightly looser standards for some of the guests, perhaps. And maybe that's why they put this Owen bloke up on level 10. But as an important side note here, Roland T Owen at the Mulebuck Hotel requested a very similar room, not facing the street and very discreet. We're now moving into January the 5th of 1935, and Owen had requested a wake-up call. Probably, I got things to do, got to get out and about, so I don't want to be sleeping in too late. So 7 a.m, he's meant to get this call. Well, the operator, because back in those days, if you're not familiar with the old style telephones, they literally had someone sitting at a control panel. So they could plug lines in and you could contact people in different rooms. It wasn't automated. So they had a physical operator sitting at a control board. Well, she's turned up and she's making the wake-up calls to the rooms, goes to room 1046 and the line's off the hook. So you'd think, well, is the bloke already on the phone or has he bumped it in the night? So she sends Probst, who was the bloke that initially showed Owen to the room, and said, can you go up and just either wake him up or get him to put his phone on the hook so I can then call him to give him his wake-up call. A bit redundant if you ask me. Why not just say, hey, go bang on the door, make sure the bloke's up, and then come down and let me know? But no, the operator really wanted that phone back on the hook. So Probst goes up, he bangs on the door. And things get strange from here on out. So settle in for quite the wild ride. Owen responds saying, come in and turn on the light. Probst can't get in because the door's been locked from the inside. His passkey doesn't work. So he just basically says, look, buddy, put your phone back on the hook. Goes downstairs, tells the operator, look, I think he's drunk. Like, he's had a big night and he's delirious. But yeah, look, he's up. He spoke to me. Well, the operator notices, still 2 hours later, that the phone is off the hook. Well, this time a different staff member, I believe his last name was Pike, goes up, but he is carrying the master key. Maybe Probst and him had a chat. So he's headed on up, banged on the door, no response. He opens the door, goes in, and there's Owen. He's not clothed on the bed, but he's naked, and he sees dark stains on the bed. So he's like, yep, he's had a big one, this bloke, like got himself absolutely hammered, probably soiled himself stupid, puts the phone back on the hook, leaves, and closes the door. Somehow, not long after this, the operator notices that the phone is again off the hook. And so she goes, look, go and sort this out. This phone can't be off the hook. I don't know why it was so critical, but it seemed to be of concern. Well, this time it's Probst goes back up. He opens the door, turns on the light, and notices an absolutely horrific scene. Owen is not on the bed this time. He is on his elbows and knees, and he's just bleeding. With the light on, he sees that there is blood strewn everywhere, all over the walls. Now, what would be your reaction in this situation? I think, now I've never been in this situation, so it's hard to judge this poor bloke, but I think that my first reaction would be to run downstairs and get help immediately, because this is rather serious. Now, whether it was shock, and it could have been, because you don't know how you react in a situation until you've been in it, but it could have been the shock that he bothered to go and put the phone back on the hook. Now, either that operator lady was just that, like the dragon lady. He didn't want to upset her. I really don't know. But he does put the phone back on the hook before going to get help. Well, the manager and everyone then start coming up and they go back to the room. Now, he's also closed the door behind him. Maybe because he doesn't want other guests to see the scene. That is a strong possibility. But when they get back up there, they can't open the door because Owen has made it to the door and he's blocking it. I think unintentionally. Maybe he was trying to get some help. Now, it's not determined exactly here, but I would say how they finally got in through the door is because Owen made his way to the bathroom and cleared the space. Not that they pushed him out of the way by slamming the door through, because the next part of the story, Owen is sitting on the bathtub in the bathroom area, and he's just got blood pouring from him. And what is now really, really odd, and I know this is a horrific scene, and I don't want to make light of it in any way, shape, or form, because this is a tragic story. Because they rang the police first. So, got me thinking, like, if you're Owen, you're in that room, would you be sitting there going, what? Why'd they ring the police? Would you go, hey, hang on, guys, shouldn't you call the ambulance? No, mate, it's too late for you. The police need to come and investigate your murder. You're like, but I'm not dead yet. Yep, but don't worry about it. Yes, soon will be. I don't know. Maybe they rang the medical people at the same time, but a doctor from a nearby hospital did turn up not long after with the police. They soon see that there's not just blood all over the walls, but across the ceiling and absolutely everywhere. This was like dreadful. They note that he was bound by his wrists and around his ankles, and also a ligature, so like someone had tied something around his neck, and it appeared that they'd tried to strangle him a couple of times. He had stab wounds in him, and one of the stab wounds had punctured a lung, and he had this fractured skull, and the head was cut open from that as well, from multiple beatings around the head. And they say to Roland T Owen, who did this to you? He goes, nobody. Well, how did this happen? Well, I just fell over and hit my head on the bathtub. And so the doctor says, look, did you try and end it all? And Owen says, no. And that's the last words that are recorded that he said. They take him down to the hospital. He's dropped into a coma. And Roland T Owen passed away that very day. So this now becomes quite the crime scene. Now, it says they found him naked and that all his clothes were gone. So even the clothes that he'd turned up in were no longer in the room. His comb, his hairbrush, his toothpaste were gone. They say that the towels in the room had been stolen. Now, I don't think they had towels in the room. Remember the day before that person said, we don't need towels, we have plenty. So I don't think there were any towels in there to steal. But all the shampoo, all the things that the hotel would provide you were also gone from the room. They found absolutely nothing in there. That they did fingerprint and found what they said were female fingerprints on the telephone. And why they say female, now there has been some major studies in this since. At the time it was just an assumption because they said, the size of the fingerprints most likely came from a woman because they were smaller. Now, I would have to ask the question, though, knowing that a lady had stayed in the room before Owen, it is possible that it was her fingerprints, but it doesn't seem that that was ever looked into, but the fingerprinting amounted to absolutely nothing. Oddly, there were a couple of things left in the room. A tag from a necktie, and it came from some particular shop. A safety pin, a hair clip, and a diluted bottle of sulfuric acid. But that hadn't been opened. So I think it's safe to say that there was intent here to do something rather serious to this poor bloke staying in room 1046. The only other thing really of note, though, was in the bathroom, in the sink, there was a broken glass. And parts of that glass were missing, and they thought perhaps maybe a shard from that glass they could have used to stab. But it looked more like there was a knife used in this attack, and obviously there was no weapons found inside the room either. So it would not surprise you then that the first person they are looking at that may have any clue about what happened here is the person who stayed in the room 1048, Gene Owen. Because what are the odds that a bloke with the last name of Owen and a person with the last name of Owen is staying in the room beside each other would not be linked somehow? And they find this story absolutely unbelievable. Surely she must have known what had happened or was involved somehow. And also staying next door, it'd be easy for her not to hear something. Well, she does say she heard an argument, but no way did she say she heard someone being literally beaten to death. That would have had to have created some noise, surely. And if you said you were up till 4 a.m., and it would appear from the evidence in the crime scene that the attack happened around that time, well, it just doesn't quite pass the pub test, does it? But her evidence was that she heard two blokes, two women, and they're having a good conversation until it turned nasty. But then the commotion she heard could have come from the party down at 10:55. But yeah, she did have that chess game with her boyfriend inside the motel room. And he also verifies the fact, yes, he was there. He left at 11. That's also all verified by everyone. And despite the absolute unbelievable coincidence, well, they find out, well, she honestly, her story checks out. She had nothing to do with this whatsoever. And so she's free to go. And they have to try and find out who was this bloke in room 1046. Who was the man, Roland T Owen? Well, the only clue they had was he mentioned he'd stayed at the Mulebuck Hotel. So they go back there and say, look, here's this bloke. And they gave the description of him. And they said, oh, yeah, no, we had someone that matched that description. But he didn't check in under the name Owen. Rather, Eugene K. Scott. And yes, as mentioned earlier, he requested the same type of room. So that also adds to the intrigue, doesn't it? Because here's this bloke basically pulling random names out of a hat. What are the odds that he used that name Owen and then someone of the same last name stayed beside him? This makes it even more bizarre. And yet they look in and find there are three or four Roland Owens in the United States at that time. None of them were this bloke. But it adds to the intrigue because Eugene K. Scott had stayed at this other hotel. So here's this bloke travelling with no luggage going from hotel to hotel. That is odd. So without any leads, the police have to try and do something to identify this bloke. So they take him to a funeral parlour, and it's said that I don't know if this is common in the United States, but like the funeral parlours on the street, and so they dressed him up and propped him up in the window. So they basically embalmed him so that he doesn't keep deteriorating and decaying. And then people can go by and see if they recognise the bloke. Now, it's said that thousands of people looked at this person. So that led to 4 instances where people said, hey, I actually think I know that bloke. The first one was a guy by the name of Robert Lane. Now, he worked for the city. Where I live, we'd call it a council worker, I guess. But anyway, he's out at night and he's driving down the road. And here's this bloke waving his arms wildly, hey, and so he thinks, I better pull up. And he slowly pulls up. And then this guy who hailed him goes, oh, sorry, I thought you were a taxi. Probably thinking at that time of night, it'd only be a taxi on the road. But Robert Lane notices he's sort of a bit knocked around a little. He says, look, are you okay, buddy? He's like, oh, yeah, just probably had a bit of a rough one. And he goes, but I need to get to a taxi. But he notices that he's bleeding. This other guy is bleeding. He doesn't have a big jacket on. It wasn't a super cold night, though January is obviously dead of winter in Kansas. But Robert Lane says, well, look, jump on in, buddy. And apparently this guy's somehow trying to hold blood from dripping inside the car. This guy had been knocked around. And so Robert says, well, look, buddy, what happened to you? He says, oh, I'm going to kill this so-and-so tomorrow. Don't you worry about it. Now, it's debatable here whether or not he used an expletive that was deleted or he actually used a name that was redacted out of the newspaper, but we don't know what word was said when this passenger said he was going to kill somebody. But anyway, Robert Lane says he saw this big mark on his arm, and that matched what he saw at this funeral home. So he was sure that he had given Roland T Owen a lift to the taxi rank. But then two other women said that they saw Roland T Owen at clubs that night with also two women. And they said that they identified him because he had a very peculiar scar. So part of his head was missing all of its hair. And there was a bit of a scar running down the side of his face. And they said, yeah, it was definitely him at these clubs. Then a bloke with the last name of Johnson, and this one is absolutely incredible. He comes up and says, that's my cousin. And he pulls out photos, and they look at him and go, you know what? It really, it's him. And then Johnson's sister comes out and says, no, that cousin died 5 years ago. But it's intriguing that they were the spitting image of each other. It could have been the same person. It was a possibility, but they could quickly rule that one out. But that is just a little bit interesting as we go through the rest of this story. And then the next one's interesting, which also adds some detail here, but a wrestling promoter. So back in those days, it wasn't WWE, which was national. They had little regional promotions. Almost every little city or state had their own little tour going on. Well, a wrestling promoter by the name of Tony Bernardi said that a guy who called himself Cecil or Cecil, depending on where you come from, but we'll say Cecil Werner, wanted to wrestle for that promotion. He said, look, I don't have a spot for you. Go to this other bloke. So he did, but they approached that other wrestling promoter, and he said, look, I've never heard of that guy at all and didn't have anyone wrestling for me that matched that description. But why this probably took the authorities by interest is because Roland T Owen had a cauliflowered ear. So that you get that from playing rugby or boxing or wrestling, because you get damage to the ears and it just makes the ear look all really, really weird. So they thought, well, maybe this bloke was a professional wrestler. In fact, the people at the President Hotel thought he might have been involved in some type of combat sports because of this ear. And he was a fairly big, solid unit. But this makes national news, and then they get nothing. They are still none the wiser as to who this bloke actually truly is. And so they have to do something with the body. And so they are going to bury him in the Potter's Field. Now, the Potter's Field is basically a pauper's burial. So if one, you have no money, no family that can pay, or basically you're a John Doe and no one really knows who you are, the authorities will inter you, and it's effectively a common grave, and it's very cheaply done. So you would think that would be the end to this story. Despite all the weirdness, like him being locked in his room, him obviously being attacked and saying, no one attacked me, but I also didn't try to take my own life. Just none of this makes any sense. Who was Don? There's just so many unanswered questions here. And so by him being laid to rest in this way, all of those, well, they'll remain lost in time forever. So that's why it comes as a total shock on the day or a day before that burial takes place. The funeral home receive a phone call from a bloke. And he's saying, delay that funeral of Roland T Owen. He's not getting buried as a pauper. I'm going to send you the money for a proper service. He will have a headstone as well with the name Roland T Owen on it, but I want him buried in Kansas City, Kansas. Now, just taking a small diversion here, this blows me away, but, I don't mind my sports, and I'm not an avid American football NFL follower, but I obviously have heard of the Kansas City Chiefs. And I always believed they were from Kansas, the state Kansas. Makes sense to me, but no, the Kansas City Chiefs are based in Missouri. But Kansas and Missouri are only separated by a river. And you got two Kansas Cities either side of the river. Now, I don't know, maybe if you're from there, let me know. Do the people from Kansas support the Kansas City Chiefs? Or is it sort of like one of those weird little odd demarcations? If you're on the other side of the river, it's pitchforks at 30 paces if anyone, dares to cross over. And so you might even totally dislike the Kansas City Chiefs because they're from Missouri. Don't know. But regardless, for whatever reason, this bloke says, I want him not buried in Missouri, but buried in Kansas. And it's said to be near either his sister or someone's sister. No one really knows who that relative nearby in that cemetery was going to be. But, he wanted a proper burial for them. For Roland T Owen, I should say. Well, this bloke from the funeral home, he's like, well, mate, what on earth is going on here? What happened to him? And so a story is given that Owen had a fiancée and was starting to do the wrong thing by the fiancée with another woman. And this bloke on the phone and then the two women decided to go and sort it out with Owen. That would match up with what Gene Owen heard, the two women and the two blokes inside the room. And effectively, this bloke on the phone said, cheaters get what they deserve. Well, the bloke from the funeral home says, I'm going to have to tell the police this. And the guy on the phone's like, no, do what you got to do. Not a problem. The money does come through wrapped up in a newspaper, so they can't identify where the cash came from. But it was enough, $25. And that was going to cover the costs of this proper funeral service. And also flowers were sent. People randomly paid for flowers at that funeral as well. So the police go, if someone's going to that much trouble, they're obviously going to show to pay their last respects. So everyone who was at the funeral was a police officer. They also had people dressed up as gravediggers in the area nearby. No one turned up on the day. But the police staked out the place for some time after to see if anyone would go and visit that grave. But no one ever did. So all of this story is now coming to an end, as bizarre as it is. But a paper reports that Roland T Owen was buried in a pauper's field, in a potter's field. That paper gets a phone call, this time from a woman, and she's saying, you got that wrong. You got to fix that. He was not buried as a pauper. He got a proper service. And the paper are like, well, that's just really odd. How do you know all this? And she has a tiny bit of a conversation. And they go, well, basically, what happened to him? And she said that he got himself involved in a jam. And I know what I'm talking about, and hung up. Well, they obviously contacted the funeral home, as this lady suggested, and also the florist, as this person suggested, and they found out, no, someone had paid for the funeral. So this got then a little bit more traction to the story. But no leads had come up from that. And so the case just went cold. But then, like most cold cases, occasionally they get put back in the public notice just to see if anyone may have fresh information, or maybe their conscience is starting to irk at them, and so they'll go and bring up some information. But it gets, again, some nationwide coverage, and Roland T Owen's picture is splashed in some articles. And so a lady from Birmingham, Alabama, sees this picture and goes, you know what? I think that looks like my friend's son, who she hasn't seen now for a couple of years. So she takes this article to Ruby Ogletree. She sees this picture and she knows that's her son, Artemus. Except the oddest thing is she'd still been receiving letters from Artemus after January 5th, 1935. And she'd received a phone call from one of Artemus's acquaintances saying that he was okay. He's actually doing really well for himself. But she knew deep down that something seriously was wrong. And she could pinpoint the day she knew something had happened, because the letters went from being handwritten to typed. And Artemus didn't have a great way with words. His letters, and they are available to look up if you want to look them up online, were very rudimentary in the way they were written. And these letters, now typed, were similar, but it was like someone was trying to, for want of a better term, dumb them down a little to make it look like Artemus was sending these letters. And she also said Artemus didn't have the skill to use a typewriter, but of course it's not rocket science. In the time, in 2 years, you'd learn how to type. You just put a bit of paper in, even back then, just wind it around and tappy, tappy, tappy. But I understand what she's saying. Because the phrasing was different, she was very sure that Artemus wasn't sending these letters. So she always had in mind what had happened to her son. And the phone call she received was very bizarre. Some random person gave his name. That name has always been withheld as to who made this phone call. But I don't believe he gave a real name, as we're going to look at very shortly. But the phone call went along the lines of, look, Artemus can't contact you, but I'm letting you know he's okay. He actually saved my life. I was getting beaten to death and he came in and saved me. But he lost his thumb in that fight, so he can no longer write to you. So obviously he couldn't pick up a phone either, I guess. I don't know. But regardless, the person said he's doing okay. He's gone over to Egypt and he's married a wealthy woman, so you don't need to worry about him. Now that is the summation of that phone call. It said Ruby was on the phone to this person for 45 minutes. So she's just stating what she heard on the phone. But she takes this to the police and says, I believe that's my son. And that scar on his head, I'll tell you how that happened. And when he was younger, a bit of hot grease fell on him in some accident. And the hair never grew back from that spot ever. So that matched the description of Roland T Owen being Artemus Ogletree. Now, the police have to do due diligence. Now, remember, that cousin, or the Johnson said, hey, that's my cousin, and they thought it very well could be. So just because it looks very much like it, and it could fit the bill, they had to make sure there was no bloke in Egypt. So they check out everything. Could someone have gone from the States to Egypt and matching that description? Doesn't stack up. And oddly too, as they then dig back through the life of Roland T Owen and the motels he had stayed in, the ones in Kansas City, Missouri weren't the only ones. They found that it also stayed under the name of Ogletree, but with a different first name. And so with all that evidence, they now know who really was the person in room 1046, and it was Artemus Ogletree. But here is another detail that makes this case even more bizarre. Artemus was not in his early 20s or up to 30s. He was only 19 years old. Now, being a big unit, cauliflower ear, all that, and the big scar on his head, he probably did look older than he actually was. But Ruby said that Artemus and a friend, Joe Simpson, decided to go off on a big adventure when he was 17 years old, and they were going to make it in the world. So they hitchhiked out of Alabama to, do their thing. all the while through that, he'd been sending letters home, and it said that the family had been sending Artemus money to keep him going. So it now seems odd that this bloke who has hitchhiked his way out of home, was asking for money to be sent to him, all of a sudden is now in suits and staying in motels under different assumed names right up until January 5th when he met the end of his life. So what really happened to Artemus Ogletree, and how did he get into this situation? Well, let's look at some of the theories. To start with, we go back to the person Don, because it is of note that he stayed in the St. Regis Hotel somewhere, and he'd booked in with another bloke. Don Kelso was the person's name. And so they suggested that perhaps Artemus and Don were involved in a relationship, and somehow that's turned sour, and Don's caught up with him because, remember, he told Don to wait. He was on the phone to Don. Did Don turn up and sort him out? That is a theory, which I don't think really passes the pub test, as we're going to see. But related to that general theory are three particular people. Yes, the police weren't devoid of suspects. They had two that they looked into quite strongly. The first bloke was Thomas Barlow. Now, he had been convicted of crimes against nature. Now, it didn't mean that he went down to the local park and start defacing a tree. The crime against nature was maybe involved in maybe male-to-male relationships that were a little bit taboo back then. So they thought that perhaps Artemus and him had been involved in some shenanigans, and that it was Thomas Barlow who was Don. So Thomas Barlow is interrogated for 10 hours, and he's giving different stories. It's changing, which generally shows a bit of guilt. But they soon work out that he's just sort of losing it mentally, because Thomas had syphilis. And if you're a regular to this channel and follow the Jack the Ripper videos, you would know that even back then in 1935, syphilis would affect people's brains. And they said, yeah, he's just becoming a bit of a mental case because of that. So they dismiss him as being a suspect in this crime. Another one which really is intriguing is Joseph Ogden. Now, he had shared a room with a bloke, had a bit of a disagreement, and as you do when you have a disagreement with your roommate, you shoot them, chop them up, put them in a suitcase and ship them off to somewhere else. That's what this bloke did. But, oddly enough, he's trying to get away with this suitcase with his roommate shoved in it, and people soon realise there's something weird going on, and he was caught. But the police dig a bit and find out that Joseph Ogden, well, he had a couple of aliases. One happened to be Don Kelso. So now, was he the Don that Artemus was contacting? Was he the Don that stayed with Artemus? Similar situation to the poor roommate that he's just got in his suitcase, all chopped up and everything. Well, the police really thought so, and they matched the handwriting that this Don Kelso had done in that hotel and said, yeah, it's the same bloke. So the police started thinking he was the one, but Joseph Ogden was never charged for the crime against Artemus. But in the preceding years, the FBI did a further investigation into this and found that the handwriting did not match. And so it's unlikely that they were the same person. Again, you would say, but that's too much of a coincidence. But just think, Gene Owen stayed in the room next door to Roland T Owen. That was a huge coincidence. So they're saying that is also just linked, that Joseph Ogden was not the person who committed the crime in room 1046. But then we get back to perhaps the young bloke. But then we look at the person that Artemus left Alabama with, Joe Simpson. Could he have been Don? Could they have been involved in a relationship that had turned sour? And then Joe has murdered Artemus in room 1046. We are going to look into that in greater detail. But none of them passed the pub test for me, for the simple reason is that Artemus was not going to give up that name of who committed this act for anything. So the question would have to be, well, why? Like, if a relationship had soured and it had turned that toxic, would you not be pointing the finger? Well, I would suggest yes. There'd have to be a reason to hold you back from doing so. But then we go to the affair. That here's Artemus, engaged to be married, fooling around with someone else. The jilted partner and the two women come to have it out with him, and it turns absolutely horrid, and they beat him to death. And maybe out of embarrassment, he doesn't want to name these people, or maybe because he still cares for one or all of them. Who knows? Now, it would make sense because Jean Owen heard that amount of people, so she says, inside that room, 2 women, 2 blokes. And yet, here's Artemus on the road. He's sending letters home regularly to his mother. And it would only been on the space of 18 months because he left home when he was 17. Like, he would have turned 20 sometime in 1935 because he was born in 1915. So he's on the road for possibly only 18 months. And in that space, he's got a fiancée, also got a mistress, never mentions that at all in his letters. He doesn't say, I've met this lovely girl. I've got to bring her home to meet you. It just makes no sense that he doesn't mention that at all in his letters. And even if it was a jilted husband and these 2 women and they decide to go sort him out, would they pay for the funeral to get it advertised? To put it back in the media spotlight? If you've just murdered someone, would you not want that just to disappear? I mean, you may feel guilty, absolutely, but I think you just want it to die down so no one looks into it any further. So that also, despite that phone call of the person paying for the funeral, it just doesn't pass the pub test. So then there's an obvious connection people make. They say the mafia was involved, hence he was the Don. Like, Don, like, wait. Yeah, Don, I'm not hungry. It was a mafia boss. So this was a mafia hit. I find that very hard to believe in the sense that here's a young bloke, 19, Artemus Ogletree, bouncing around hotels, having direct contact with the mafia leader. Just doesn't make any sense. I do not believe that, one, the Don would have turned up to his room to murder him, or the Don would have made a personal phone call to him to see if he was hungry, or made a visit to his room at all, if he was involved in those connections. And I would suggest you're not leaving a note for the Don on your bedstand either, because that also just doesn't pass the pub test. But I believe there is a solution, and this is now where we're getting to. And I say there's 3 pieces of evidence in this story that are just staring at us that help us unravel the mystery in room 1046. Now, just to get a little bit of understanding of the history of the United States in the 1930s, Prohibition had been in force for a little while, and if you don't know what that is, you couldn't buy alcohol. It was banned. So you take something away and make it illegal. Who's going to profit from that? Organized crime. Not necessarily the mafia, but anyone that's got a way of, circumventing some rules will find a way to sell the products that people want. And that was happening everywhere. But Prohibition ended in 1933. So we're talking 18 months or so after this. So organized crime were pivoting to keep making money. And so gambling became quite the thing. And you can look up some history of Kansas City, Missouri, and some of these hotels. You see, lots of little like gambling situations were happening everywhere. Now, I'm suggesting here that maybe they had been involved in a little bit of gambling. And they'd won some money, but perhaps not in the best way. But you're two young guys, and you've had a big windfall. So what are you going to do? Well, you're going to live it up. You're going to stay at the places, the best places. But you probably don't understand the consequences of the people you've taken the money from. And they are not going to be too thrilled with it. And you're going to say, oh, and that's a long bow to draw. Yet I would say, in every story or lie even, there's always an element of truth. And that phone call from the bloke wanting to pay for the funeral, cheaters get what they deserve. Yeah, he told this fanciful story of, like affairs and all that sort of thing, which just really doesn't stack up. But if you wanted to send a message, what was printed in the paper? Cheaters get what they deserve. They wanted this advertised. So now Joe and Artemus are in a situation where they have to pay this money back. So there's two things that could be possible here. One, Joe did seem the brighter, so they said, look, you've got, say, 3 weeks to pay the money back. We're holding on to this bloke, Artemus, until you do. And if you don't, well, the consequences to Artemus are going to be rather severe. Now, whether or not that's exactly the case, I think a version of this really makes sense, because it would explain why Artemus was under threat. They probably said, if you run, we're going after your family. And a 19-year-old kid probably doesn't understand how difficult that would be for a group from Missouri to go down to Alabama and exact revenge on family, even if they knew who the family were. It just would be very difficult for them to do so. But a young guy being under this threat probably didn't know. And so he's fearful for his life, but mostly for the life of his family. It clearly explains why he could check into a room, but you note that as soon as he checked in to the hotel president, he left. And then the next time they see him, he's locked in the room. So he probably was under instruction. He had to go deliver a key. Now, he had a room near the stairs, so it would have been easy for people to come in and out without using the elevator. And the second real piece of evidence, so that first one is cheaters get what they deserve. The second piece of evidence is the note on the bedstand. Now remember, he was leaving that room when the cleaner came in because he didn't have a key to get out. So maybe he had to get out to try and make a phone call to find out what was going on. Were they going to get the money? But he didn't want the people who locked him in to turn up and find him gone, because in his mind, he's thinking they're going to go and go after my family. So what does he do? He writes a note saying, Don, I'll be back in 15 minutes. Wait. Not wait for me because I want to catch up and have a cup of tea. He's saying, wait, don't do anything until I get back. I am coming back, so wait. Wait to give the order. That makes sense. But unfortunately for Artemis, time does run out and they make a statement. They have to send a message. And the attack on him was absolutely brutal. Now, it's possible with these people, there was a party on room 1055 that was making a lot of noise. That could have hidden the noises happening inside 1046. And that could have been organised by these people, absolutely. But when the papers start saying, like he's getting buried in a potter's field, they want it known that this was a message sent by them. And so they make sure that it gets in the papers, the comments. So they pay for the funeral, they do all that, get flowers sent. And so anyone in that area would know you don't mess with these people. 1, you don't cheat, and 2, you pay up. And so when the paper don't get it right, someone else rings in and says, you better make a correction here because, we did this. And that does work. It gets printed in the paper. But now you're going to say, but Owen, and this Owen, not Roland T Owen, who was Artemus, but you're going to say, Owen, hang on. What about the letters back home and the phone call? Well, this to me really, really seals it, because I believe strongly that Joe Simpson was involved somehow in the initial things going downhill. Them getting themselves involved in a situation that was way beyond them absolutely. So he knew about it. He may have split. He may have taken off, realizing that, look, I'm getting far away because they won't be able to find me. Well, Ruby, she's not happy with this, and she hunts down Joe, not literally, but makes sure that she can find him, because she believed that he knew, or in her mind, she did the crime. But put yourself in Joe's situation. You've got your friend, your mate who you've gone off with, and he is now been brutally killed. You don't want his mother, that you know, probably you'd spent time playing as kids growing up together. So you know his mother. You want to make sure that she thinks that Artemus is doing great. So you start sending letters home. And then you realize you can't keep doing this, so you make the phone call. And in that phone call, I believe he gives away the true intent of what he was trying to say. And that's if Ruby does recollect the conversation, because it wasn't recorded. But the 2 points: he saved my life, and he can't contact you anymore. Because it is possible that Artemus took the fall for the entire situation. And so Joe would be living with tremendous guilt in this situation, but wanted to let Artemis's mother know what a hero he truly was. Well, Ruby does catch up with Joe and has this conversation. It took a while. He was ditching it for a long time. And she said to him, I would recognize the person on that phone call. And she said he went red, got flustered, and basically said, look, I'll send you a letter that Artemus had. And that's the last she ever heard from him ever again. Now, many people say in her mind she believed that he was the murderer, but if you read a bit further, she says, I either knew he did it or he definitely knew what happened to Artemus. And I believe he really, really did. But it wasn't that he was the perpetrator, but he was trying to cover for it. So in summary, I believe it was 2 kids that got in way over their head. One took the fall for the other, and that's why Artemus was not going to give up the name of the people who attacked him. And then Joe felt obligated in perhaps the wrong way, but out of good intention, to cover it over with Artemis's mother. And that is what I believe is the solution to the murder of Artemus Ogletree in the President Hotel in room 1046. But let me know what you think. Does this pass the pub test for you? You may have more information. Throw it down there in comments. But as always, I genuinely appreciate you watching, viewing, liking, subscribing, and particularly sharing this content wherever you are. I'm Owen, you've been watching The Pub Test, and we will see you on the next one.